Hello and welcome back to the Old Code Podcast. I'm your host, the Professor. This is Season 2, Episode 1. Today, I'd like to give you an overview of Plato and his philosophy. In my previous episode on Socrates, I briefly touched on his philosophy, but since nearly everything we know about Socrates comes from Plato, I figured that we should explore more of what Socrates taught in this episode concerning Plato, since we can't really tell where Socrates ends and where Plato begins. My personal belief is that the pre-Republic writings from Plato give a more accurate Socratic philosophy, but once you get into the Republic, you start getting a synthesis of Plato and Socrates' ideologies. As I previously mentioned, the dialectic approach was a key feature of early Greek philosophy. In that vein, if you take Socrates as the initial thesis and Plato's philosophy as his sort of antithesis, then what you get in the Republic and other portions of the dialogues is his synthesis between the two. At any rate, let's introduce Plato. I'm using Diogenes Laertius as my primary source concerning his early life and origins. As such, it is strongly believed by most scholars that Plato was born roughly 427 to 429 BC. His original name was Aristocles. If I'm remembering correctly, that basically means noble born or noble birth. He was named after his grandfather. We don't believe that Plato was in any way a family name. We don't see it in his family history of any kind, so we know that it wasn't his birth name as well. So, he was supposedly a direct descendant of Solon, the ancient Greek lawgiver, and as such, a descendant of Poseidon himself. Now, it was common practice in the ancient Greek community to tie prominent people to divine origins. Alexander the Great himself roots his own lineage in the line of Heracles, and is thus a descendant of Zeus himself. This helped provide a sense of grandiosity and nobility, or even a legitimacy for the person, as their understanding of divinity was not as transcendent as what we consider now, but it was more ascendant. When we look at Homer's Iliad, we can see Achilles being described as godlike, not godly, so we can understand their conception of divinity as effectively a heightened form of humanity, or humanity as sort of lower form of divinity. This is further able to be seen when we look at Hesiod's Theogony, where the earth and sky beget the titans beget the gods, and the gods beget humans. So we see that humans are, in a sense, a species in the genus of thinking creatures, and since intellect was the primary means of relating to the gods, that we are in the same class as them, just lower and less powerful. But back to Plato. Plato, born Aristocles, came about his more known name through one of a couple different possible sources. Plato comes from the Greek Platon, which means broad. This is supposedly given by his wrestling coach for his incredibly broad shoulders. His wrestling coach, if I'm remembering correctly, Ariston of... I don't currently remember the rest right now, but Ariston names him this as he's got incredibly broad shoulders. Secondly, this may have been a self-moniker. The broadness might be in relation to his vocabulary, his eloquence. He was known as a gifted orator, so the possibility that he was known for a broad base of knowledge and capacity for communication is equally possible. Cicero, if I'm remembering correctly, even comments and states that the broadness was in relation to his broad chest. So there's two possibilities where it's a physical characteristic. The third is his vocabulary, but also Cicero saying he had a very broad chest. In the ancient and even pre-modern world, to have a broad chest meant you could project very well. You could speak quite loudly. You could talk to all sorts of masses. So it's sort of in between, where he's both an orator and known for his physical prowess. So, according to Diogenes, he studied at the school of Dionysus, or the theater of Dionysus, where he learned the teachings of Heraclitus and Parmenides and Pythagoras. But ultimately, around the age of 20 years old, he became a student of Socrates. Before he studied under Socrates, he had studied art and poetry. However, upon introduction to Socrates' philosophy, he, according to Diogenes, put his work to the fire and basically saw that it was vain. But we can already see that he was an intensely intelligent and broadly learned individual who was familiar with both physical and mental strain. He was, like I said, commented on by his wrestling coach as a very strong and very skilled individual. Likewise, he's seen as a pupil of Socrates, and so there's this mental and physical development of this man. Plato initially taught from his own home once he started being a teacher himself, but he would then go on to found the Academy in Athens, roughly 387 BC, where he would teach until his death, and this was during the 12th year of Philip of Macedon's reign. The manner of his death is uncertain, as Diogenes recounts that he died at a wedding feast. Tertullian states that he simply died in his sleep. He was accounted as a man too great for envy, according to his epitaph, and was even honored by Philip himself at the time of his death for being such a great teacher of wisdom. Among Plato's most noteworthy students was actually Aristotle, who was the tutor of Alexander the Great, son of Philip of Macedon, but that is a story for another time. Plato is not always incredibly popular amongst his contemporaries as well. We know that among Socrates' direct disciples, he was rather disliked. Xenophon, as I previously mentioned, wasn't overly fond of him, as he wrote his own iterations of the works such as the Symposium and Socrates' Apology. Diogenes of Sinope, likewise, was an intensely aggravating thorn in Plato's side. I'll break away from Xenophon here because I already covered that somewhat well enough in my previous episode, and I believe we may actually do a full episode on Xenophon in the future. He's a fascinating figure. But there's become a fixation in modern culture on Diogenes because he's kind of known as the philosophical bad boy. As I've grown and matured, I find him to be more annoying and less useful, as I just don't believe that he contributed all that much. He was a cynic, and so he was basically a pessimistic sophist. That's the way I would describe the cynics, is that instead of just asking questions for the sake of asking questions, they were systematically questioning absolutely everything that was presented to them. I don't feel like doing an entire episode on Diogenes, so I will leave it at that. However, Diogenes was convinced that Plato had misappropriated Socrates' thought and reasoning, and thus had very little respect for him. According to Diogenes Laertius, again, at one point someone had challenged Plato to describe man in as few words as possible. You're probably already familiar with this story, but Plato responded to this with the famous two-word description of man as featherless biped. Upon hearing this description, Diogenes came to one of Plato's lectures and threw a plucked chicken down, declaring, "Behold, Plato's man." Upon this incident, Plato extended the description to featherless biped with broad, flat nails. Diogenes was also known for simply coming to Plato's lectures and defecating in the lecture hall. I think you're starting to see how I don't actually think that he did that much that was that great. But I digress. Whether or not Xenophon and Diogenes are correct concerning their interpretation of Socrates is another matter. Both men were initially cynics, though Xenophon did eventually become a Stoic. They had their own biases and their own perspectives, and as such we cannot say who's right and who's wrong in terms of Socrates. However, given that it was Plato who would become one of the most prominent thinkers of his generation, it ought to be established that either his system of thought or his method of communication were seen as more useful or generally more accepted by those in his day, or even perhaps more accurate than these two. Diogenes Laertius himself was a self-proclaimed Platonist, and Plato's ideology would continue on for another almost 1,000 years. So I think that it's a resounding applause or accolades for Plato and his interpretation of Socrates. So Socrates, and therefore Plato, taught so incredibly broadly that I could really spend the rest of this podcast's lifetime just covering all of the topics. However, since I do intend to talk about things other than Plato and Socrates, I'll be condensing Plato's teaching to a couple of points. If you are a initiate into Plato's teachings, philosophies, a fantastic starting point is Plato's Republic. It's where I started. It's where a lot of people start. I think it gives a really great 30,000-foot view of what Plato thought and what Plato taught. So, granted, there are certain parts that we're not entirely certain whether or not he's advocating for a position or if he's just doing a thought exercise. So, best starting point I'd like to give would be Plato's cave analogy from the Republic, as it gives us that launching point from which we can discuss his other ideologies. So, if you will allow me, imagine that you are in a cave. Your hands and feet are shackled to the ground. Your head is clasped in irons so you can't turn from one side to the other. There's other people with you, so you can talk to them, but you can't really turn and really address them. You exist in a state of basically total darkness apart from one wall that is illuminated directly in front of you. There's also a sort of partition right underneath that. Now there's essentially a puppet show that passes in front of you where the only thing you can see is the shadows of the puppets, but not the puppeteers or even the puppets themselves. For those dwelling in the cave, for you, the reality that you are perceiving, the only reality that you can perceive is the shadows of those puppets. And you don't know anything other than those shadows. That's all that they know, that's all you know from your birth to your death. But finally, after generations of people only knowing the shadows, one man breaks free from his shackles and escapes to see the reality of the world. He's not just seeing in black and white and in 2 dimensions anymore. He sees the world in 3 dimensions and in colors, in ways that the cave dwellers have never seen before. He isn't just perceiving the impression of the thing, but he's seeing the things in themselves. When the man tries to return to the cave to explain what he's seen, he's viewed as a madman and ultimately driven away from his community. So this is Plato's understanding of the philosopher. Sense perception, as I mentioned in the previous episode, had already been thrown into question as far as reliability goes. But the philosopher, through reason, is able to break free from his chains and witness reality for what it truly is. As I mentioned in the previous episode, this sense reliability had been thrown into question. Thus, it's really only reason that's left to actually try to establish what reality is. Now, one of the reasons I would suggest that this is a more Platonic line of thought is because the reception of the philosopher by the cave dwellers seems to almost anachronistically describe Socrates' trial and execution by his fellow Athenians. He's received as a madman because he's pointing out the shadows. I mentioned this, that this would be helpful to be a launching point for more Platonic ideas, and so this allows us to discuss what I'll refer to as Plato's theory forms. Plato posits that something is a thing because it participates in what he calls the form of the thing. For instance, the eternal illustration that everyone and every philosophy professor will always use is, why is a chair a chair? Plato would say that a chair is a chair because it participates in the ideal form of chairness. there is an ideal chair from which all chairs derive their chairness, essentially. This is a physical image of what the forms are, but this is what the dialectic approach is trying to do when Plato is asking questions about justice or goodness, and what these are actually. When he's asking someone what justice is, he's focused on the fact that people keep on giving him instances of justice as opposed to an actual definition of justice. But back to the cave analogy, the cave dwellers are effectively only able to see the shadow of the thing, which is an instance of the thing. But the philosopher is able to use reason to perceive the thing itself, and therefore he is able to understand the form of the thing. His theory of forms was his best attempt at synthesizing the idea of eternal change from Heraclitus and the eternal changelessness of the universe from Parmenides. We discussed Parmenides in the previous episode, where he basically stated that change was impossible. So the form represents the changeless and unspeakable nature of the thing, but the thing represents the constantly changing and comprehensible aspect of the instance of the form. So many of Socrates' dialogues are basically him trying to use dialogue and reason to get to an appropriate definition of what it is that they are talking about at that time. His work, Phaedo, is a dialogue trying to acquire what the soul actually is. The soul is kind of rendered as the form of the person, as the soul is immortal and constantly being reborn again and again. This gives us helpful insight into his philosophy, wherein Plato believes that all learning is effectively a recollection of those things which we already know from previous lives. Crito discusses his theory of the form of justice. Cratylus effectively discusses whether the name of the thing reflects the accurate form of the thing, or if it's just a matter of convention. So, I digress. This portion would be my own interpretation of Plato and Socrates, but when Socrates is critiquing Homer's view of the gods, he's trying to get at the fact that the poet has only discerned the shape of the gods. He hasn't discerned the form of the gods. This is again why he was executed for impiety, as he threw into question the traditional view of the gods in the Republic. He essentially makes the claim that Homer had it wrong and says that the gods cannot change, they cannot lie, and they must be the author of all goodness. He's saying that Homer is only seeing the shadow of the gods. He's not seeing the forms of the gods. I apologize. When we come to Plato's Republic, we're left with the question of whether or not Plato actually believes that the society he's engineering, in theory, ought to be put into practice. His Republic is made up of a three-tier class system, wherein one is born a certain quality of person. Since Plato believed that the soul was immortal, he would maintain that some souls are and always will be born gold, silver, or bronze. The bronze soul would be best suited for the trades. They're not meant to be philosophers. They are meant to do the grunt work of society. The silver soul is best suited as the guardian of society, and the gold souls are meant to be the philosopher kings. We can start to see once again this affinity for Spartan society in Plato's thought. The bronze class can be compared to the hoplites. They were a subjugated group of people in Spartan culture who had no rights and were constantly subjected to whatever the Spartans wanted to do to them. In fact, the initiates into Spartan culture were often encouraged to basically make the hoplites' lives more difficult, and they could just kind of hunt them at their will. They did all the grunt work, which allowed the Spartans to focus solely on their pursuit of becoming their perfect warrior culture. Since Plato believes that it isn't good for people to focus on more than one thing and to become the best you possibly can be in your area of learning, he emphasizes that each class should remain in that class for the good of society. Therefore, in order to have the most effective warrior or guardian class, he fashions the silver caste after the Spartans effective. They're dedicated to their craft of defense, but he suggests that they must have the inherent attribute of dogs, who can intuitively tell between friend and foe. Interestingly enough, there's a fascination with dogs between Diogenes and Plato. Diogenes, if you look at any painting of Diogenes, he's always surrounded by dogs. Socrates, or Plato in this instance, or Socrates, is comparing the guardian class or caste to dogs, as they can automatically sense who they need to be kind towards and who they need to be aggressive with. So the guardians are meant to enforce the ruling of the philosopher kings, which finally gives us the golden class, or the philosopher king. In contrast to the Spartans, who would always maintain a warrior king, he puts the philosopher at the pinnacle of society. Now, they're the ones who can truly discern the form of the true, the just, the good, and the beautiful. So they are the ones responsible for disseminating that information for the ruling of their society. Since the form of something is ultimately incommunicable, the philosopher king must know the appropriate way to communicate the necessary truth of the thing without descending into incomprehensibility. So that gives us an overview of a couple key things in Plato's philosophy, which segues into how Plato has been appropriated into contemporary society. So one of the issues with Plato's Republic does seem to be the introduction of a eugenics program, essentially. This particular theme actually seems to crop up in early 20th century in America and Germany, when they started to take certain cues on how to form a society from Plato's Republic. The result of this is that certain undesirable or less useful people would be left to either die or be sterilized, as was a common practice for both the Spartans and much of Greco-Roman society. The early American eugenicists, such as Francis Galton and Margaret Sanger, advocated for sterilization and abortion for the purification of the people. Likewise, the German desire for a purely German Germany, devoid of what they would deem as a blemish, would lead them to destroy the lives of those they deemed unfit for their Aryan society. American political hierarchy bears a resemblance also to Plato's Republic, as we have policymakers, policy enforcers, and policy subjects who are meant to keep the country going. Now, I would say the illusion in American politics lies in the fact that we have people who are made of bronze making the policy, and oftentimes we leave it to those made of gold to enforce the policy. A further irony I find in Plato's Republic, later on in his work, he has this whole diatribe against poets and actors, as he's staunchly opposed to representation, as representation is inherently not the thing, and therefore it is, in a sense, a lie, since you are deceiving, in a sense. I find this incredibly ironic because Plato uses Socrates as his mouthpiece. So that's roughly how we see Plato's influence. I've already previously touched on Platonic dualism, which is the nature of the body-soul distinction. We already see a preeminence of the soul in Plato's thought, which is why the soul or the psyche is elevated over the body. The soul is the form, the body is the instance. So what can we learn, especially from the Republic? So Plato may have had his theory of being born into a class wrong, but I do believe that he was onto something when he said that people who are outfitted for a particular position are best suited for that position. I believe we can see, I would describe it as alchemy. And I believe that this is what the American dream was kind of founded on, where the bronze can transfigure into gold. But right now, our society seems to believe that everyone, right as they are, is made out of gold. You are perfectly fine as you are. So I believe that the recognition that certain people are currently in a state of bronze, essentially. I think that we need to recognize that. Since our policymakers have been so fixated on the benefit of trade and business for the better part of our lifetime, and the lifetime of our nation, even I would say we have sorely neglected the flourishing of the people, and that comes at the deficit of moral development, of philosophical development of ethics and virtue. So I say that our policymakers are made of bronze because of the focus that American politics has on business and trade, which, in Plato's formulation, is the realm of the bronze. Policy and business and trade are effectively meant to just keep a nation going. It's not meant to be the end goal of a nation. So this has led our laws to be mostly rooted not in morality, but in preservation of economy. We can see this in how corporate-sponsored lobbyists have aided in the formation of policy for the benefit of those same corporations. We can see this in numerous areas. What we refer to as reproductive rights emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century, but these rights pretty much correlate to the entrance and emphasis on women in the workplace. It's kind of a chicken-egg question, but I would say that we weren't so much concerned with the actual women themselves, but how they could contribute to the economy. We can even see this in early jaywalking laws, they were enforced during the industrial boom of the automotive industry. Pedestrians became a secondary priority to the cars, which were contributing to the economy. There are hundreds more instances of these laws coming into existence, but the fact remains we live in a bronze era of America, not a golden one. In the 18th and 19th century, I would say we did see a strong belief in the broad and deep education of our leaders. I've mentioned it in the past, but the debate at the time would go on for literal hours, but they would be off the cuff. They would be able to go and research and make sure that they had a well thought out argument, but these people would give 45-minute long speeches in response to another 45-minute speech, and they weren't doing it from notes, they were doing it from memory. And we did expect them to be moral and strong and disciplined people. There's a reason why it was a pleasant moniker, that Honest Abe was honest. We expected virtue. Now granted, there are a great number of moral blemishes in that area. And we can look and say at one point we did expect gold of our kings, though. We really did expect philosopher kings. We expected them to be well educated. We expected them to be broadly educated. So I would say that at one point we did have that, but we shifted toward a more economic mindset. Moreover, in that same vein, what we ought to be pursuing when contemplating not only the macro scale of our nation, but the microcosm of our lives is the idea of pursuing the form of goodness. We ought to seek to better understand the base principles of our actions instead of just how it is to have an instantiation of something good. And we get that question all the time because we're trying to appeal to the letter of the law as opposed to the spirit of the law all the time. We're not trying to get at the form of the good that our laws are meant to represent. We're just trying to get at the specifics of what is being communicated. So I think that's all I have for you today. I hope that this lecture helped give you a little bit more of a launching point for Plato and Plato's ideology. I find him to be an absolutely fascinating figure, but I do find that certain aspects of his ideology were false. I think that a couple moments in the dialogues read like a Reddit or Tumblr article circa 2012 where somebody says something and everybody claps. So whether or not everything happened as he portrays it, that remains to be seen. However, that's not the point of the dialogues. I wouldn't necessarily say that the point of the dialogues was to convey an absolutely accurate series of events. It was meant to be a thing that communicated the ideology. So these aren't lectures, these are philosophical dialogues meant to communicate something. So all that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like it, please subscribe, whether you're listening on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, whatever you're listening to. I really do hope that you liked this episode. And next week, next week we are off again. I will be traveling. So next time I believe I will be covering Aristotle and the basics of his ideology, which then can let us explore Alexander the Great, the student of Aristotle. So I hope you are doing well, and it really does mean a lot that you are able to listen. That's it, and bye for now.